All right, welcome back. So, this mini lecture is going to look at the early Republican period in American history, so the early 1800s. The five big points that we're going to be highlighting in this mini lecture will be a search for nationalism, expansionism, federal power and its questions, international trade, and American foreign policy. All right, so first off, Americans are really going through a time in the early 1800s when they're questioning, what does it mean to be prideful about their country or have a sense of their country's identity. Remember, you couldn't take an American history class, for the most part, in the early 1800s. So, if you can't look to those kinds of things, can't look to certain, what do you look to? Well, Americans look to a few things. First off, they looked to events. They looked to events in their own timeline of news that for them represented a sense of what it meant to be American. So certainly feeling a sense of loss at the passing of George Washington was a big event. Certainly the starting of more public celebrations of the 4th of July as a national holiday, right? That was a strong or a key thing. Something like the dual death later was a key event as well. For those who are unaware, the dual death is on the 4th of July, 50 years after July 4th, 1776, where both Thomas Jefferson, the architect of much of the Declaration of Independence, and John Adams, the second president of the United States, who were at times friends, at times political enemies, and then later in their life friends again, they both died on the same day within a few hours of each other. And Senator Daniel Webster laid this pretty clear in a statement or a speech about this, where he felt this was a time of America was changing, a generation was passing, a generation was shifting. Now, another example of something that would be big here is going to be expansionism, right? America is growing in size due to the acquisition of the Louisiana Purchase. America is growing in population during this time period, but it's also a time period in which you are starting to see new institutions being used a bit more robustly to grow the American economy and the American state, primarily after the War of 1812, right? So this is the American system, right? So you're starting to see the Second National Bank come into fruition. You're starting to see tariffs to try to protect American textiles. You're starting to see national transportation networks becoming a point of emphasis. So 1811 is the beginning of the construction of the National Road. This is the era of the new steamboat technology that is kind of coming in, right? So Robert Fulton is a name here that is good for folks to know. Thirdly, Americans are questioning sort of federal power, right? This is a time period in which there are a lot of discussions on the role of the national government in our lives versus the role of the state government in our lives. And a lot of this is being played out, or local governments in our lives. And a lot of this is being played out in the courts. So the best example of this would probably be the Marbury versus Madison case in the early 1800s, where the Supreme Court takes up the mantle of judicial review as a result of the case. But generally, this is a big question that's going on. Fourthly, I would say that questions of international trade and economic expansion are also taking place. So late 1700s, early 1800s, this is a time period where America is no longer under the protection of the British Empire and economic arm, and so we need to sort of set out and establish trading relationships independently here. So this is the time period of our developing trade relationships with China. This is the time period in which fur trading with indigenous peoples in the Midwest and West is occurring more robustly. These kinds of things are sort of developing a new, American economy as we sort of enter the early 1800s. And fifth, or lastly, I would say foreign policy, right? So remember, the late 1700s, early 1800s is a time of great change, of great transformation. Both the American Revolution is occurring, the French Revolution is occurring, the wide-ranging independence movements across Latin America are occurring here. The United States recognizes a number of those new nations as sovereign. But this is also a time period in which America is starting to sort of create its own stronger foreign policy. Something like the Monroe Doctrine would be a good example of this in the early 1800s. Now, there's a lot to critique with the Monroe Doctrine, obviously, but it was a foreign policy statement under the era of the President James Monroe in which the United States proclaimed that the Western Hemisphere was kind of our purview. Now, this is coming on the heels of the conflicts between Spain and its former colonies. This is coming on the heels of the French Revolution and the coalition wars that have been fought there as well. But this was a strong statement on the part of the Americans. So, thank you very much.